Alright, what's up everybody? This video is going to be titled something along the lines of a Stoic approach to strength. And in this video, my goal is to encapsulate my entire mindset and philosophy when it comes to progressing my lifts in the gym. And I've talked about this in more specific scenarios a fair amount on this channel, but I want this to encapsulate everything. Alex Leonidas made a video a couple months back titled Why Strength Matters. And I think there continues to kind of be this ongoing debate within the fitness community on whether you should or shouldn't care about strength. And I think that debate in itself, whether you should care or shouldn't care about strength, is almost missing the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that you should be focused on taking a stoic approach to strength if hypertrophy is your main goal in the gym. So I think the best thing I could do right now is define what stoicism means. And this is just according to whatever dictionary Google uses, but the definition I have written down makes the most sense for the context that we're using here. So the definition of stoicism is the endurance of pain or hardship without the display of feelings and without complaint. So what exactly does that mean? It's pretty straightforward. It means that you will endure a specific hardship, and keep in mind it's going to be mostly kind of a feeling or emotional thing with lifting, and part of it is of course going to be physical too, but you can't entirely separate the two. So in some way, shape, or form, you are going to be going through discomfort, whether it's from trying to detach yourself from a specific feeling you have towards strength on a certain lift, as in not ego lifting or pushing outside of your comfort zone on some lifts, whether it's one or the other, it's kind of besides the point. And you're going to do it without the display of feelings and without complaint. So that's really what it comes down to, and it's a pretty simple approach. And you'll notice that when I talk about that specific approach to training, whether you care about it or not doesn't really matter. And I would actually argue there are two different ways to care about strength, and each can be counterproductive if you aren't aware of them. A lot of people have kind of gotten on the case of the people that are obsessed with strength in a positive way and they chase it at any expense, but nobody talks about the opposite of those people, which is obviously for a fairly specific reason, which is it's kind of a newer phenomenon. And I would argue that my channel may have even had a role in that, where you just get people that don't care about, they kind of use not caring about strength as a mask to not go heavier. But if you actually just look a little bit deeper into what they're saying, they actually do care about strength, just in a negative way, which I'll touch on in a second here. So for me personally, just to be as transparent as I possibly can, I genuinely do not care about strength. But that's not what actually matters, because whether I need to be strong or not, I can endure it either way. So whether I have to hold back or get outside of my comfort zone, to me it doesn't matter, because strength isn't what I care about. I'll do whatever it takes to get results. And if that means dropping my ego at the door, or if it means getting outside of my comfort zone on a specific lift and going heavier because it's more efficient, I'll do either one of those. And just to be even more transparent, those are just examples. I don't actually have an ego with the numbers that I lift, and I am never afraid to go heavier on a specific lift. I haven't been that way for my entire lifting career, since there were times where I was like brainwashed into caring about strength, but I didn't genuinely care about it. So just from a genuine perspective of myself, I really don't care about strength. I'm just here to get bigger. If I could get away with benching 135 in the Smith machine and have that grow my pecs forever, like, I would actually do that. People will make fun of that, but I would actually do it. But the problem with some people that take that perspective is they use their supposed not caring, in air quotes, about strength as an excuse to just never go heavier. The reality is they do care about strength. They're just not viewing it in a positive way. They're just simply afraid of getting stronger and lifting heavier. I'll talk about that in a second here. So most lifters do not take a stoic approach to strength. They care about it one way or another. Most lifters do. Some lifters care about it in a positive way. And what I mean, when I say positive, I don't mean it's always going to be like a good outcome and it's a good thing. I just mean they positively anticipate strength and they enjoy the process of strength gains occurring. So you can take like powerlifters, for example. They enjoy seeing the process of their PRs in their training blocks and whatever. So that's someone that cares about it in a positive way. That isn't a good thing. That you can absolutely get carried away with having that mindset, as I have in the past. And I'm not going to detail it all in depth here because I've talked about it way too many times on the channel already. Some lifters care about strength in a negative way. And a lot of these people, this is probably what I'm going to spend most of this video discussing. These are people that take a philosophy like mine, where I genuinely don't care about strength one way or another. These are people that are afraid to get stronger, afraid to get outside of their comfort zone, and they stay light and they're afraid to progress their weight on any lift because they say they don't care about strength. But if you just listen to what they're saying and look at what they do, look at their actions, look at how their progression schemes work and all the excuses they make to not lift heavier, those same people, like how do they never end up going heavier on any lift? Well, the reason is simple. They're afraid to get stronger and they're uncomfortable with adding weight to the bar for whatever reason. Maybe they secretly do care about strength and they don't want to potentially see themselves fail the next weight. Maybe they're afraid to have a more challenging weight on the bar that's like genuinely a more appropriate weight for the setup that they're using in terms of their program context. Either way, that second person does care about strength. It's just in a negative way. They absolutely still do care about it. It's not just something they enjoy. It's just something they're afraid of. It's just the other side of that same coin. So how you approach strength progression should be context dependent, not feeling dependent, regardless of how you feel about strength in any given scenario. So to expand on that, the way that I approach my strength progression is I base it off of my exercise selection, and it's fairly straightforward. But if you take a lift that's highly stable with very little room for technique deviation, I'm going to be adding weight at a pretty rapid rate because I'm going to be growing at a pretty rapid rate because I train hard and I obviously do whatever I can to gain muscle. Of course, that isn't going to go on forever. Like eventually I'm going to run into slower gains and whatnot, but I'm at a point where I'm still gaining size at a fairly rapid rate and on a strict, stable lift that allows you to see strength progression directly as a result of muscle gain and not necessarily technique progression or technique deviation allowing for more cheat. Like, yeah, if I'm seeing rapid strength progression on a hack squat, yeah, my quads are definitely getting bigger, and I've been able to see that. So it's very context dependent, and I can't talk. It's very context dependent, and it really depends on what lifts you're doing. So let me talk about a couple specific scenarios here. There is a problem with being emotionally driven and chasing strength in the squat, bench, deadlift. I'm not saying you can't enjoy the benefits of gaining strength. If you enjoy being strong, then absolutely, that's fine to like enjoy those plus ones and enjoy those little PRs and everything. That's okay. You just can't let that override your decision making. And if you're using a squat, bench, deadlift variation, that is okay, and that's perfectly fine. But I find that most of the time with these lifts, those are the lifts that people love to go the heaviest on, specifically with lifts that are less stable. So if you take like, not even just for the squat, bench, deadlift, but I'd argue even the bench press and deadlifts to a degree are more stable than squats. But if you take something like squats or pull-ups, these lifts are the lifts that people love to go the heaviest on, which if you take like a practical bodybuilding approach, that doesn't make that much sense. And the reason for that is because these lifts are overall less stable. And I'm not talking about the opposing force. There's a solid opposing force on both lifts. You're training a specific muscle when other arguably bigger, arguably stronger muscle groups and a lot of joints are exposed and unstable in those lifts. So if we dive into the squat, for example, if you take a barbell squat, in a hypertrophy program, the context of training to build as much size as you can, a squat is in your program to train knee flexion. It's to grow your quads as much as possible. So a barbell squat, if you're trying to train your quads as much as you possibly can, get the most direct growth and stimulus to your quads, you aren't going to be using the most weight that you possibly can if you're just going from point A to point B. It's probably going to be like, I don't know, 80% of what you could maximally handle for just the squat pattern in general. And the reason for that is because your quads aren't as strong as your glutes and your spinal erectors. If you use a hip dominant squat, you can tap into not just some activation of the quads, but you're going to be using the glutes and the spinal erectors, which are two big, strong muscles that will completely overshadow and take over that lift from the quads. So on a lift like a barbell squat, people get obsessed with the numbers, but it's at the expense of their quad gains. And that's where you need to be a little bit more stoic with it and leave your ego at the door if you're going to use something like a barbell squat. You'll eventually be strong, but you genuinely just have to practice patience, not get too high on your highs or too low on your lows. So don't get too attached to the PRs, but don't get too down on yourself for having to use less weight than you know you could. That is an ego issue. And the same kind of goes for something like a pull-up. A lot of the time in pull-ups, and I see this arguably more often, people are very, very quick to add weight to their weight belt. They're very quick to kind of just brush off the assisted machine. And I'd argue those are two ego-driven decisions. And the problem with pull-ups is that, again, you're doing a pull-up to target, it's generally speaking, it's going to be the lats. And the problem with that is your traps and your general upper back and your elbow flexors are all very strong muscle groups that can assist really easily. The pull-ups are stable in terms of you have a rock solid grip, which acts as the opposing force that you can pull up against. That's obviously how you get your chest from point A to point B. But you have so much room for technique deviation because nothing is supported. So your abs can crunch forward, your back can arch, your back can start arch and then round as you pull. You see that all the time. The shoulders can shrug up. You can retract, protract, elevate the scap so you can turn them forwards like this, moving your entire shoulder girdle in general. You can move your shoulders up a bunch and round your back like this, and now you're pulling with mostly elbow flexors, and you're taking your elbows through more of a range of motion than they should be, just causing more fatigue to another area. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong technique-wise with a pull-up, and I don't want to spend all day just nitpicking pull-up technique, but you can see how being obsessed with strength and going to the point of using the most weight that you possibly can on a pull-up or a barbell squat is actually counterproductive for your technique. So people, they have these certain feelings that make them want to lift heavier than they should be on lifts that are less stable. And then you can kind of say that the same thing in kind of the opposite context is true when you take highly stable, highly standardized lifts with very little room for technique deviation. So you take something like a preacher curl. People are afraid to go heavy on preacher curls, and you could say that's for other reasons than just, it's a lift where you're not allowed to cheat your technique and express more strength than you truly have, which boosts your ego a little bit. People are afraid of tearing their biceps, but you could even say the same thing about like a machine chest press, for example. People have no ego attachment to something like a machine chest press. So they don't care how much they lift. So they hold back in terms of their desire to add weight to that specific lift just because they don't have a specific feeling about it. So it's kind of the same thing, just in the opposite context. So that's equally as bad of an issue in my opinion. So if you're holding back on highly stable lifts for one reason or another, whether it's because you don't positively care about it or because you negatively care about it and you're afraid to go heavier and get outside of your comfort zone on a lift that has no potential issues and only benefits from going heavier, as long as your rep ranges are reasonable and your overall range of motion and tempo is under control, that's just an excuse to not go heavier. And I'd argue a lot of the time, simply just going heavier on a highly stable lift is a really good option because it's just more efficient. You have less other issues that you can run into. So if we're going to take that barbell squat example, that's not a lift that you should stay super light on or push maximally in terms of strength. You want to be in that kind of happy medium range. If you were to sub that out for something like a hack squat, now your hips are supported. It's a highly stable lift. The machine chooses your bar path for you and you can't deviate from that. Your hips are locked in. There's a pad on your shoulders, which keeps your entire back straight and locked in. The only joint that's exposed is your knees, which is the one you're training. So on a hack squat, as long as your rep range is reasonable, you're getting enough depth, and your tempo is somewhat under control, you can go as heavy as you want to on a hack squat, and it's only going to be more efficient. So this is where if you are someone that does kind of positively enjoy chasing strength and you enjoy hitting those PRs, that's a really good lift for you. And on the other side of that same coin, if you're somebody that is afraid of going heavier on something like a hack squat, there's no excuse to not go heavier other than a specific feeling that you might be having of being afraid to get outside of your comfort zone. You have to realize if you're taking a stoic approach to strength, that is invalid and you have to go heavier on that lift, whether you want to or not, whether you care about it or not. You have to go heavier because it's more efficient. Once you get to, say, 10 plus reps with controlled slow technique and a pause. Like, I'm sorry, objectively, you will be making better gains by just going a little bit heavier and doing normal tempo for like 6 to 8 reps, because you have far less variables getting in the way of you achieving that desired proximity to failure, which is the ultimate goal of your working sets anyways, through things like cardiovascular fatigue, respiratory fatigue, just psychological and mental fatigue. It's much easier to give up. Like, all those little things. There's even the sensations too, of like the burn and the pump and all those sensations locally that can just make you want to give up or feel like you're closer to your desired proximity to failure than you actually are. And it blurs your own judgment, because let's be real, when you're in extreme discomfort, especially on a challenging rep or a challenging lift in high rep ranges, when your brain's all foggy, do you really think your decision making is going to be all that great? I'd argue it's probably not going to be that good. So the next things I want to talk about would be using less weight and getting more out of less weight, however you want to say it, because they are kind of different things. But for the sake of simplicity, let's kind of put them all in the same category. Whether it's using less weight for an equal outcome, whether it's using less weight for an arguably better outcome in a lot of cases, especially on things like squats or pull-ups, it is an advanced technique to a degree. So beginners overall have less control over their body and the movement that their body does and their technique. That is for multiple reasons. You could say one reason is because they have less muscle, so they just don't have as much general strength in the entirety of their body. You can say they have less experience in a specific lift, so they're not as aware of where their technique might be faltering. And those are kind of the two main reasons, but they're also just not psychologically trained to embrace and chase that discomfort in a good way. Like, a lot of the time, feeling like the burn and the pump and feeling that the uncomfortable sensations of a muscle experiencing high stimulus, that is something you have to train your brain to enjoy. And ultimately, any good lifter will kind of chase that feeling. But when you're a beginner, you haven't fully embraced or like kind of adopted that approach yet. So your instincts are still not overridden by your own more conscious desires, and your subconscious instincts will always try and get you away from that discomfort that you need to get into. And whether it's like a feeling or even just like fatigue in a specific muscle, that's why beginners, as they approach failure, their technique starts to deviate much sooner and they have a much harder time getting into more grindy reps. Like on pull-ups, a beginner is never going to be able to have perfect form and have like a grindy 3 to 4 second concentric with good form, because their technique is just going to fall apart completely before they even get close to that point. So for beginners, you have much less control over your body and over your technique. So going heavier on a highly stable lift is usually going to be a good idea, because you just have to push hard. You don't have to worry about your technique as much, and that is huge, and it gets overlooked. I would also say that beginners grow at a faster rate, and you outgrow your working weights much quicker. So if you're a beginner, and let's say you're on Smith bench or preacher curls. So say you're doing 125 pounds on Smith bench. If that's your working weight, you'll be at like 130 or 135 within like a month or two, like if that. And obviously beginners are pretty vague example, because there's a big range of beginners. So if I say you'll get to this weight in this amount of time, don't take that too literally. It's kind of just an example, but a beginner will outgrow their working weight very quickly, where an advanced lifter has to take a lot longer at a specific weight because their muscle gains are just slower. So those rapid strength gains, as long as you're not cheating your technique and you have like good exercise selection as a beginner, that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. And you should seek out heavier weights mostly across the board as a beginner, because that will keep your training more efficient. And like the reasons I just mentioned before this, where you have less control over your body and everything like that, heavier weights are just going to be a much more efficient way to train. You don't have you don't have like the physical awareness or capability of getting more out of less weight or using like that advanced technique quite yet, because your body's still trying to squirm out of challenging reps in the first place. So if you think you can override that and make your technique even better, it's just not going to happen until you're more advanced. And what you have to do now is just embrace kind of those more rapid muscle and strength gains. And once you are bigger and stronger, you'll be able to get more out of less weight when it would actually benefit you anyways, in terms of like lowering fatigue and keeping your joints more fresh overall, and just being more precise as you need to as you become more advanced. The last couple of things I want to touch on is that this one is bodybuilders aren't weak. This is something that I think a lot of people don't quite understand. Bodybuilders sometimes might use a little bit less weight than they're capable of using just because they have to keep their joints fresh, or maybe they have to be more precise with their technique. Like instead of moving weight from point A to point B, they're actively making it more difficult. So a quick example on this is like, I was using 310 pounds for like 9 reps on Smith bench with kind of crappy technique when I was a little bit more bulked up. And now that I've cut down a little bit and refined my technique because I was getting some AC joint inflammation, what I've been switching to is a Larson press with no retraction or no arch. So that's causing me to use much less weight. Now I'm down like 50 pounds on that lift for roughly the same, maybe a little bit more in terms of reps. But I'm using like 260 pounds, which is arguably not that strong, but if I was just to go back to my old technique, like I would instantly be strong again. So that's a good example, a quick example of just how, even though I might not be expressing the maximum possible strength, I absolutely am a very strong person. And that's not just me, that's really any bodybuilder. Of course, the guys that are super lean aren't going to be able to display quite as much strength, but relatively speaking, if they're just as strong as you when they have like 8% body fat, when they get up to your body fat, they're going to absolutely mug you. So bodybuilders aren't weak. And I would actually argue that bodybuilders are some of the strongest lifters out there across the board, if not the strongest. They're just not as specialized in certain like explosive compound movements or movements where they're just trying to move the weight from point A to point B. But they absolutely have, I would say, the most strength potential out of any lifter out there. So if you look at like even my numbers on like Smith JM press, who else is Smith JM pressing 250 pounds for 8 reps? Who else is preacher curling 120 pounds for, it was either 4 or 5 reps, I don't exactly remember, but like, though you can't just look at squat, bench, and deadlift where you're just using powerlifting techniques or anything. You have to look at general strength of what the muscle can actually produce. Like, I'm one of the stronger people out there as far as like natural lifters with like a comparable context to myself, like training age, body fat percentage, physical age, all that kind of stuff. Like, I'm one of the stronger guys, and I don't say that to brag or anything. I just say it to make sure like you guys know the reality of being a bodybuilder is if you actually get big, you are going to be very strong. And if you're not very strong, you're probably just not that big. But you can't also twist my words and say, oh, well, you're not strong because you can't deadlift that much. It's like, well, if I was to train the deadlift, my muscles that work in the deadlift are like, they're pretty big. So if I was just to get used to the deadlift again, like I'd probably be a pretty strong deadlifter. So hopefully that all makes sense. And ultimately, just what I want to finish this video off with is the key with this whole thing is to recognize where you are caring about strength, and positively or negatively, and to allow your logic to override your feelings instead of the other way around. So let me know your thoughts on that. Let me know if you have any questions. That's all I got for today. I'll see you guys in the next one.